The cause-effect relationships are by and large timeless. There's evolution. Evolution is how something changes over a period of time. And then around those things are these cycles, because if they're put in the same position, let's say a Federal Reserve is put into a position of having to decide, do you have defaults or do you print money? There's a choice, and that choice repeats over history. And so you can see what are the indicators of that position and what are the reactions and what are the choices. So the cause-effect relationships, by and large, remain the same through history. But there's always a reason. We're changing the world order, okay? In 1945, we started the New World Order. What I mean is, throughout history, there's a fight for control, because there's no world court that you go to and plead your case. And so there's a fight for power. So there's a war, and then the winners come out of that war, and the winners set the rules. And so, 1945, the United States had 80% of the world's money. Gold was money at the time. It had half the world's GDP. It had a monopoly on military power. So the U.S. set the world order. That's why the United Nations is in New York. Washington, D.C. has the IMF and the World Bank. And its currency became the reserve currency because of that set of circumstances. Things evolve. Things change over history. The large debt puts central bankers in a choice. Do you pay it back with hard money, or do you pay it back with printed devalued money? And if you pay it back with hard money, it's hard. In other words, that's when you have debt crises. So in all cases, they eventually print money, and that produces inflation. That's the place we are at this moment. Okay. The second is when there's a great internal conflict. Usually when there's a large wealth and values gap at the same time as you have a financial problem. Then you get populism of the left and populism of the right. In other words, those who feel disenfranchised want people who are going to fight for them. They don't want compromisers. They don't want them to be in the middle, because middle means that they're not fighting for them. They want them to have guts. So you have populists of the left, and their positions harden, and there are no compromises. That's why we're potentially in a situation that you could see in one of these elections, maybe in 2024, that neither side would accept losing. Perhaps we see that. Maybe you don't follow the rulings of the Supreme Court. Anyway, these things have not happened in our lifetime, but they happened many times in history. So if you look at that, you see from those patterns why the gaps become greater and the positions harden, and you see the dynamic. So that's the second. And the third is the rise of a great power to challenge the existing great power. In other words, I gave you the example of how the United States was so dominant in 1945. Now it's not as dominant. It is not dominant. In other words, China and the opposition is as strong as the United States and its allies. And so we have a conflict. And there are 5 kinds of wars, and they start in this order, just sequentially, typically. A trade war, a technology war, a geopolitical influence war. Then you get into a capital and economic warfare, which we are now with sanctions. They always happened in history. And then there's a military war. And so you could see that progression happen through time. I think that there's a tendency to look at the economy in a rearview mirror, seeing low levels of inflation, and also not understanding monetary inflation. There are 2 types of inflation. There's an inflation when the demand is pressing up against the ability to produce. So we had that kind of inflation. Unemployment rates go down and there's a limit to the capacity to produce. There's also a monetary inflation. And a monetary inflation means, very simply, if you produce more money in credit, if that increase is greater than the production of the goods and services, prices will go up. It creates a spiral, which we're seeing now. In other words, the selling of bonds. So it makes the imbalance become greater, because not only do you sell the bonds to pay for the deficit governments do, but holders of bonds choose to sell bonds because they're not producing a good real return. Now, that just mechanistically may be a little bit tricky for some people, but what that means is when you have a big supply-demand imbalance like that, either interest rates have got to go up to curtail that demand, or the central bank has to print more money, and they always print more money. So that dynamic of monetary inflation, the type of thing that makes the 70s, or the type of thing that makes inflationary depressions like happened in the Weimar Republic in Germany in the early 1920s, that kind of inflation I don't think is paid enough attention to. Inevitably, there's a certain amount of debt that has to be paid. And one man's debts are another man's assets. And the more debt you have, the bigger the problem is. And so when you have a lot of debt and you have to pay it back, you're either going to pay it back in hard money or you're going to pay it back in depreciated money. And that becomes the choice of the central bank. That's why you get stagflations. That's why we have an environment like we have now. You have economic weakness. You have a stagnant economy, low growth, and with high inflation. And that happens through this monetary situation that I'm describing, in which the central bank tries to deal with a middle course. In other words, what does the central bank want? Not too high inflation and not too low growth. And so when there's a lot of debt, because one man's debts are another man's assets, it becomes very difficult, a balancing act. And that is when you have stagflation, when you produce it. So just like in the 1960s, late 60s, we spent a lot of money on guns and butter, we called it, right. The Vietnam War, social programs, and so on. We wrote too many checks relative to the money we had in the bank, which was gold at the time. 1971, the devaluation. Then they print a lot of money into that stagflation. So stagflation is the middle course when there's two different. So think about it this way. How does he literally fight inflation? Because everybody says tight money policies. And how do you fight inflation? The way that happens is you get people to spend less by taking money and credit away from them. Right. So he will reduce the amount of money and credit that's available. The Federal Reserve is going to sell $1.1 trillion of debt that it has, debt assets, bonds. Right. And then they're going to raise interest rates. So they create a squeeze that reduces demand at the same time as people don't have enough money because inflation is high. The buying power is less. And then what that act is to reduce buying power again to reduce inflation, but it comes at a big cost. And that is stagflation. I want to explain inflation in a very simple way. There's a certain amount, quantity of buying, that is of how much money and credit you're given, divided by the amount of quantity of goods and services sold. In other words, if there's a lot more money and credit produced than there is goods and services produced, you will have an inflation, and the magnitude will be a function of that ratio. Over that period of time, there was a very enormous amount of money and credit that was produced, and there were some bottlenecks and shortages of production and disruption because of mostly of a combination of COVID and also geopolitical issues. Yeah. So there was some effect. Most of the inflation came from the production. We attribute it. We can go down to actually calculate it. Most of that was due to the enormous increase in money and credit and spending that was produced. If you now look at the United States, it's no longer dominant militarily. It's no longer dominant economically because China has become comparable and is a larger trading partner with other countries than the United States is, the amount of trade and so on. It's a very unique power. Think about it. You can print the money that the world will accept. Now that means when they accept it, they buy your bonds, they buy your debt. That's what they hold these in, which are promises to receive this currency that you could print. So there are two things now that are jeopardizing that position. Dollar's now strong, but there are two things, we want to hold on to that position. Two things that threaten it. First is the printing and devaluing money, but all countries right now are doing it. So in all countries, currencies are depreciating against goods and services prices. And then the other issue, which is interesting, is the weaponization of the dollar in the form of sanctions. America is certainly in relative decline. In other words, has been. Education is not the same. Military power is not the same. Economic power is not the same. If we're looking at, how we're behaving with each other, it is not the same. This is the question. All currencies, usually during this period of time, depreciate together. So in the 1930s, all the currencies depreciate. They depreciated then against gold. They depreciate against assets, against real estate prices and a number of things. But we're coming into a new world in which the real question is what will be the new currency? And it may not be just a government currency. Is it crypto? Is it gold? Is it other things? And we'll find out. So a currency is a medium of exchange, and we'll have all of those currencies continue to be, including the dollar. But it's also a storehold of wealth. And that means that the bonds, or what you store it in, has to have a real return. And none of the major currencies have that. That's why you're seeing movements out of all of those and into other assets, and why you're seeing the bond market sell off. The production is now going based on ideological and political considerations. In other words, I talked about self-sufficiency. If you look at China will be self-sufficient. The United States will be self-sufficient. Multinational companies are going to worry about where they're going to have trade and so on. So the notion of how do I deal with self-sufficiency? We're in a world where ideological and political forces are allocating resources more than economic. Given the risks in the world, they want to be self-sufficient. And similarly, the United States wants to be more self-sufficient, and other countries are wanting to be more self-sufficient because they're worried about being cut off. It's the nature of the beast. Capitalism is a fabulous way of allocating resources to get rich, but it gets people at different rates. They get very big differences, and also produces a lot of debt. That's part of the capitalist process. And so when there's this large debt and when there's a large wealth gap, people feel disenfranchised. So it happened in Europe. 4 major democracies chose autocracies because of the fight between the left and the right. Then they called it fascism and communism. But those two, the right and the left, and how to deal with it has always happened. So you go back to the French Revolution. In all of those cases, there were moderates. There were people in the middle who said we have issues and we have to deal with those types of issues. But the polarity becomes greater. When the causes that people are behind are more important to them than the system is in jeopardy. You know how it is. How did Donald Trump get elected? What was the characteristics of the population? You can go back and you could see that. So you have fighters on both sides who do not
want to compromise.
They don't want, it's considered weak. And if you're in the middle, you will have to pick a side and fight. There's the loss of the middle. What we need right now, in my opinion, is a strong middle. You need a strong middle, but you also have a political system where you have 2 parties. And because of those 2 parties, there's a tendency to become more and more extreme because those extremities on each part of their party become stronger to win a nomination. Measures of extremism is that, roughly speaking, about 30% of the population is rather extreme of the right, and about 15% is extreme of the left. Of course, that represents then the majority of the Republican Party is in that category, and then a very important part of the Democratic Party is
on the left.
Yet the majority of Americans are in the middle. So you still have, given those numbers, they add up to maybe 40 or 45% of the population. But we don't have a party in the middle. You don't have a middle. Investing in education and infrastructure through history have been the most important ingredients. You can't make better investments than in education and infrastructure. They pay and they produce a more broad-based prosperity. But we don't do that because of certain reasons, the Constitution and the like. But in order to do that, you need a platform of the middle. You need a spokesman, I think, that draws people away from the extremes toward the middle. If you did have a third political party, and I'm not saying that's practical, but I would say then you could have a platform, and then you could have somebody that you could look at, or candidates that say, I am for the middle, and that would help to neutralize. Because otherwise, history has shown you go to greater and greater extremism, and then you have the battle. And I think that that's what we should be afraid of most, is that those extremists in a battle having a type of civil war, which I think there's a reasonable chance of. When I say a civil war, I think that the rule of law and constitution can be of diminished value relative to power, such as in the elections, neither side accepting losing, such as the Supreme Court makes rulings that are not followed by states, such as population moving from one state to another because the values in that other state are more there. And so then it becomes a make me type of situation. Rather than saying, what is the law? It says, make me do that thing. And now when we lose that kind of rule of law and respect for the whole, I think that's a type of civil war. When you watch that, who knows where that leads? It could lead to violence. The whole idea in the Constitution of holding arms, and how many, there are more arms than there are people, and so on. And when you get into a make me mentality, you could get into an armed situation where a lot of people and guns and crazy things. I'm not going that far, but I'm saying let's bring that back a notch and talk about, can we imagine, you and I, we know history and we look at today and it's different. Could we see the failure of following the rule of law and the Constitution? So somebody gets elected and you now know who's going to be in the seat, or you don't follow that and you get into a power-based situation? Yes, there's a possibility. And the fact that we consider that to be a significant possibility, I put the odds of something like that at about 40%. History has also shown, and we see it, that people have to pick a side. They pick a side and they speak to it. So you watch in the media. Do you get unbiased reporting? It's hard to come by. Even exchanges of thoughts. It wasn't like this. Even the issue, let's say, of, Disney in Florida. In the past, each could have a different perspective. You wouldn't weaponize. You wouldn't retaliate to the same extent that we're retaliating with exercises of power and so on. You have to benefit the majority of the people. It's narrowing. Just by any of the measures since 1980, per capita income for the bottom 60% of the population has not risen. If you ask your surveys, it's a failure. Every system needs to be improved and modified and made better. And I'm a mechanic, so I just look at the cause-effect relationship. It is because there is an element in which the reinvestment of gains do not go down to create the basics. What are the basics? Here's all you need. Parents who will take good care of you, a good public education system, and equal opportunity. That's all you need, as existed throughout history. You give those things to people, and by and large, you have a much more prosperous, you could draw the talent from wherever it is. So those are the things. And we're in a spiral because also the children who grow up in some of these areas from childhood, and they don't have the parents, they don't have the circumstances in terms of the basic equal education and so on. And that population is a growing population. And so we see then the disenfranchised. Other issues is because that population. So let's just go back. How did Donald Trump get elected as president? There was a population that was a disenfranchised population that wanted somebody who was going to fight for him, like populists do. The profit system alone is not good enough. The history of these situations make one worry about such things because the conflict and so on goes through a difficult time. I believe that we're at a moment in which we have a choice, and it largely depends on how we are with each other.
We being Americans.
Americans, and then we being, it could be Americans and Chinese, but we as humans have a choice of how we are going to be with each other. The world has more resources than it has ever had. It has more wealth than it has ever had. It has inventiveness that will produce fabulous gains, and that'll continue. But the issue is really, are we going to be dealing with that as a together society? It's very simple. Don't go to war with each other. Work together, right? Don't go to war. If you do that and you realize we're all in this together, and then I don't care how you get there in terms of that element. I do believe in thoughtful disagreement, the art of thoughtful disagreement. I believe in win-win relationships, not lose-lose relationships. And my principle is, if you worry, you don't have to worry. And if you don't worry, you need to worry.
You need to worry.
Because if you worry, you will do the things that prevent you from happening the thing you're worrying about. So, for example, if I look at the term civil war, and I look at the term international war, and I can paint a picture, a realistic picture of what that looks like, so the people really see it, like the people who went through those wars in history saw it. If I can paint that picture and then say, one thing we can agree on is we don't want that. Okay, we do not want that. So how? That's why I would like to see in the United States, I'd like to see us get strong. I'd like to see a strong middle. Anybody who has gone through a war, this is true for history, you see what happens is the polarity becomes so great that there's no talking. There's just mutual intimidation and there's a fight. And you get beyond the stage and the middle gets lost. There's the capacity, a lot of capacity to increase the size of the pie and divide it better. And I'm a capitalist, so I don't mean just handing out money wastefully, but I mean there's so many opportunities to improve productivity and produce opportunity in various ways that I just can't believe that we're not doing it, and we could do it.
You point out in the book that often a rising power and a declining power, where they cross, end up in a war. Do you believe China and the United States are going to end up in a war?
I believe that there's a significant risk of it, but I don't think it's probable. As I say, well, there are 5 types of wars. We're in 4 of them.
Right.
And we're at the edge of a 5th.
Which is a shooting war.
That's right. So we are in a trade war, we are in a technology war, we are in a geopolitical influence war, and we are to some extent a capital and economic war. We are there. And we are dealing with military issues, particularly as they pertain to Taiwan. We're close.
Could Taiwan be the thing that led us to war?
If we go to a military war, it'll almost certainly be the Taiwan issue. I think we want to contain China. Their concerns are mostly the domestic concerns. How do they deal with the demographics issue? How do they deal with their own domestic issues? You know, when you run a country, the major issues are the internal issues. How do you make sure you deal with corruption? How do you deal with all the issues that they face? Poverty in the east, in the western part of China, environmental issues, the property bubble that's bursting, the COVID issue. So look at it this way. It's a big thing. The population in China, the capitas, are more than 4 times that in the United States. Since I started going to China in 1984, per capita income has increased by 27 times. If it increased to half of what the United States is, that would mean its economy would be twice the size of the United States. So it's a big force. The main reason that China did not denominate its exports and trade in the currency and did not denominate its lending is that they didn't want to be a threat to the United States, because that's a threatening act. If the United States loses, now we were in a different era then, just to explain it. They became the largest trading country in the world. In other words, did more trade than any other. They could have operated in their currency. In terms of lending, international lending, they're the largest lenders, and they could have done that in their currency. They chose not to because they perceived that that would be a threat. They were not trying to disrupt the world order. But now we have a different set of circumstances worldwide. This leadership was the same, of the same mind. And I think is pretty much today, they don't want to disrupt the world order, but they want to be as great as they can be. They want to be as rich and powerful and so on, but they don't want to disrupt the world order. If you look at history and you understand international relations, which is very much like Confucianism, what you have is called a tribute system. And that means each country is in the place, they know their place. They know the hierarchy. Like in the old days, it's almost like other countries would be almost a vassal state. You would say, I know that you have the power, you pay respect, and you operate in a harmonious way. But the idea of war is a horrendous idea. So I think that they would probably be just as happy if you divided the world in half, their half, and we had our half, and there was peace in the world. I'm just saying an objective is not to dominate the world. An objective is to operate in a way where there is no such war. However, that they are as strong and powerful and healthy and prosperous as they can be. I think it's very difficult for a lot of Americans who hold close to them the treasured, I live the American dream. I know equal opportunity. I know the ability to speak up. I know that those types of values, but it's difficult for other Americans to understand why they have a different point of view about what works better. A very good example of a cultural case. I think it was the NBA team. An individual spoke out on Hong Kong, and the Chinese not only punished that team, but they punished the NBA. And in our, like I would say, everyone should have the right to their opinions and to be able to have free expression. In their view, if somebody's doing something wrong, that they will punish the group. They'll punish the family because the group is supposed to be responsible for that. They don't understand it from the internal values way having to do with Confucianism, the history, why it's more autocratic, top down, what they believe about democracy.
The Chinese leadership is paranoid mostly about maintaining the power of the Communist Party.
Well, they would view that as very similar to us saying the power of the Constitution, because that is the system, that's the order. In 1949, they made a system. And that's the system. When we think of party, we think of that same multiple party type of thing. They think of it as very top down, very hierarchical. And it's like the family. Vice President of China, Wang Qishan, described it to me. He said, it's top down, Americans are bottom up. And the question is, by the way, we have this issue, are we fighting for that ideology? These are bigger questions. Are we fighting for a democracy and capitalism? Or do we believe that others can find their own approaches and may the best approach win out? That becomes a big question as we pursue it. So that is their approach, may not be my approach. They will not give that approach up any more than Americans would give up the Constitution, let's say, or their freedom of speech up. So we just have to understand it's like a religion. You know, as we have different religions all around the world, they're deeply held beliefs, and each believes in that they're going to get the right outcomes by pursuing them. And what do you do about that?
There's also the question of human rights. And clearly, the Chinese have a different view than a lot of people around the world. How do you approach that?
Well, there's me and there's every one of us. It's a cosmic question. Every one of us who buys products, or all the businesses that are operating and interacting with China or operating in many countries, I could list a number of countries, the interconnectedness of the relationships with China. We import 22% of our manufactured goods comes from China. If you're buying your Apple or you're buying your sneakers, you're in a position that's somewhat similar to me in terms of thinking about what the issues are. What I do is I rely on the guidance of the government, both governments. I think in studying their dynasties, I studied the Tang dynasty, which is around 600, and I studied also other societies. It is the things that I've talked about before. It is in broad-based education. That Confucian system was the first meritocracy that came in to create broad-based education, and then they would have exams, and the people who would get the jobs would be the people who were the most capable, and they got away from corruption and those types of things. I wouldn't characterize some things as Chinese. I think that in the history of China, there have been good dynasties and there have been bad dynasties, but there's always the common ingredients of what makes a country successful. And they've been that way uniquely. If you do look at the history, I've studied the powers and the different strengths. China has hit through history up until around 1840, been always like number one or two in the country because of hard work, because of meritocracy, because of being highly civilized. In other words, they are working in the same direction and they operate well to be productive together. Those are the same elements, but it's not just Chinese. If you go back to many empires and many civilizations, those elements have been the timeless and universal elements that have been the source of success. But of course, there's always a balance between being a revolutionary. It's always how far do you take it? So in China right now, there's entrepreneurship, investing in all the ways, empowering, and it's really a capitalist type of approach among entrepreneurship, but they'll call it state capitalism, that kind of an approach. And then there's the question of order. So it is always in getting that balance correctly, because you can have disorder. Like in the United States, we could have enough disorder that could be disruptive to that process. So it's always the issue of getting that balance right. Right now, I think the tilt in China has been a bit more autocratic. And so they're trying to strike this balance with also creating what they call Little Giants program for entrepreneurship and so on. I think it's become too much that way. And I think just in the United States, we're becoming a little disorderly.
Is there any dissent in China?
Oh, dissent. There's not the same kind of open dissent as there is in the United States in terms of how people can speak as freely, nor the media speaking freely, or even listening to things. No. Dissent is more under the surface, particularly now. The leadership evolved greatly also by the circumstances. When he first came to power about 9 years ago, there were two big issues. Corruption, and that the system, 5 major banks lent to state-owned enterprises and local governments, and there was no capital market for small, medium-sized businesses and entrepreneurship. And so if you take on the progress they made tremendous progress along those lines. They now have capital markets, and they've done a tremendous job of reducing.
In a country which is ruled by the Communist Party.
Right. But in their way of doing it, which is that it's run like a company, sort of. There's a board and they operate that way. But in that time, there was a move toward more, at first, 2 5-year terms. So when they moved into the second 5-year term, because of infighting, there was this, what they call core management. So there are 7 standing members of the Politburo, and 4 of them became more the allies of Xi Jinping. And there is a belief that they're going into a more challenging environment. And then they had this series of challenging, and it's become more autocratic than it was before, more nationalistic. I would say they feel more threatened, and it's created more nationalism. So we've begun this dynamic where it's no longer a win-win relationship. It's more like a chess game. In other words, where do you put the pressures on? We're in a war. The power of man, it's in man's hands to be able to work well together and to come up with the inventiveness. If we did those things well, I'm not worried at all. The acts of nature being such a dominant thing, I didn't know that, and then I saw that. There are charts in that book that shows life expectancy, shows per capita GDP, and seeing that these things would last. Maybe they're 10 years, maybe they're 5 to 10 years, really terrible wars and so on, but they don't kill most people. And most people get through them one way or another, and then they pass, and then you move on to a higher living standard. And so that arc just always keeps coming up because of man's adaptability and inventiveness. The power of that also came through loud and clear. And that's why I keep coming back to the point that man has that power, and also it just comes down to using that power and being good with each other. It very much depends on the people too, that the people play an important role. The dynamic between what the people allow or demand of their leaders is very important. It's not just the leader. But what I learned about leadership was good leadership varied according to the time and the circumstances that existed. So, for example, Adenauer, who was one of the great leaders in Henry's point of view, what came about after a country lost a war, and it required a certain type of great man for that particular time. And so as time changed and circumstances change, the definition of what a great leader changes. But a great leader, in any case, understands the circumstances and has the vision to carry that forward, and that there's a dynamic with the population. And so can you get the population behind you, even when it's a disorderly population? That becomes the great question. Can there be great leadership?
Unbalanced, having really looked at dynasties and looked at history and examined it and looked for the lessons, and think about the moment we are in at this moment. I'm thinking primarily the United States. Optimistic or pessimistic?
Concerned.
Sure.
It goes back to the point before. I would say I would be more pessimistic than optimistic, but I believe the power is in the population. If they find a strong middle, if they work together,